So, we're here to, we talk about Book 8, right, of Augustine. And Augustine's moral conversion chapter, right? So, Book 8 kind of represents. Let me start over. Sorry about that. You can probably hear me now. So, sorry about that. We're here to talk about, obviously, Book 8 of Augustine's Confessions. Uh, Book 8 is about Augustine's moral conversion. Sort of it represents the sort of the steps that led to Augustine to Augustine's conversion. Um, Sort of in 386 A.D. It's when this time frame is. Um, this chapter, you kind of understand that Augustine affirms his intellectual certainty gained from reading the books of a lot of Plato and a lot of the Platonists, and even the Epistle of Paul, right? St. Paul in the Bible. And basically, that God exists and that he is supremely good and all powerful, right? Supremely good, um, omnipotent, is all powerful, and beneficent, is all good. But Augustine finds that, there's kind of a difference between knowing something intellectually, right, and living that thing or living one's life according to that knowledge, right? In other words, between knowing the good, right, and doing the good, right? So by the time of this reading, Augustine is aware that that sort of his problem is not a problem of the intellect, right, but of the moral sort of fortitude, the stability. Um, in order to attain his stability of character, he needs to accept the way of God, the way of Jesus specifically as Savior, right? So, by that sense, we mean sort of humility and a sort of acceptance of one's own moral sickness and demise, right? And a sort of openness of the healing power of Jesus Christ, right? But there's a sense to which he is unwilling to sort of give up the conviction of his own sort of moral freedoms, right? Not just to follow God, but maybe I have the free will to act according to my own decision making. Um, um, Sort of, it represents itself. There's a line he says in chapter 8 that the Savior is pleased with me, right? And but I was but I was still reluctant to enter into its narrowness, right? Its narrowness, meaning, yes, I could follow God and follow Jesus and just do what Jesus says, but there's a sense in which I need autonomy to broaden myself up, right? This is why, again, like I told you the other day, the existentialists like him because he is talk about personal autonomy and decision making. But in order to receive some guidance, you read in here that Augustine goes to see someone named it says, a Simplinicus. He is a bishop, right? And he tells Augustine the story of Victorinus, who was a pagan, noted for sort of his understanding of philosophical texts, specifically Neoplato or Neoplatonic texts. After studying scripture with the sort of the same intensity as he previously did pagan literature, Victorinus suddenly sort of informed Simplinicus that he has decided to become a Christian, right? So Simplinicus in turn replies that he is not, he will not believe that Victorinus is a Christian until he sees him in the church, right? Going back to what book two, the idea of the walls of the church, right? Hesitating to enter the church for fear of offending his pagan friends, right? Um, Victorinus tells Simplinicus or responds to his challenge by saying sarcastically, or sarcastically questioning whether it is in fact the walls that make the Christian, right? So again, going back to the idea of the building, the walls, the structure. So Victorinus is telling Simplinicus that, yeah, you might be looking for me to go to church in order to find out that I'm a Christian, but is it actually the walls, right? And so there's a sense to which Victorinus begins to sort of overcome his pagan doubt and hesitation and seeks to be baptized within the church, right? And so the result of his experience is that Victorinus becomes a sort of a model, a sort of a role model of Christian piety and goodness, giving up his career as a rhetorician, right? He was in rhetoric for the sake of his new faith, the church, right? But the account of Victorinus also tells us in this reading that the purpose of inspiring Augustine to following Victorinus's footsteps, right? So, excuse me. So when he says, a man of yours, Simplicius, told me all about Victorinus, and I was on fire, right, to sort of be like him. Or I think there was something, I forgot the language, but you read it. And this is, of course, was why he had told the story, right? Because he wanted Augustine to sort of be like, right, Victorinus. So, but what aspect of the story in particular, I guess, is the question, is Augustine set on fire to be like, to imitate? The significance, I think, of Victorinus is that of a sort of a man, maybe even a great man, who chooses sort of the obscurity, the sort of the hiddenness within the church, right? By humbly submitting to the church's authority, he now has the power of the collective body, excuse me. He now has the power of the collective body of all the members within the church, right? To sort of inspire and guide and guide them. Augustine, I think Augustine compares Victorinus to Paul's story in the Bible, right? Who we know Paul, another great man whose pride was beaten down, Saul to Paul, right? And who became a sort of a simple man in Christ, right? Give it all up, become like Christ, right? So in that sense, both Paul and Victorinus are compelled to forsake their pride, forsake their arrogance and their self-reliance, and in doing so, find a sort of a greater strength in becoming members of the church. Again, members being within the body, right? Um, so this example would show then that Augustine is sort of, he's set on fire, is excited to imitate, is the example of one who rejects presumptuous path of self autonomy, right? I can't do it by myself, right? And I need the mercy of the church, right? So that's a good point you should kind of lock in, that maybe I just can't do it by myself, and that is really a precepts of the church, right? You need the church to help you through this process, and the mercy of Christ within the institution of the church is important, right? So this is, I think, the example that we're supposed to be inspired to sort of be set on fire, right? To know that we can't be like him, right? Well, we can be like him, but we can't do it on our own, excuse me. that we need to kind of align ourselves with Jesus, right? So, uh, the habit chapter, right? Augustine says, right, he may be set on fire to sort of imitate Victorinus, but he finds himself being held back, right, by what? His own will, right? So that's why I quote the other day, like I love when the Catholics say, I'm not worthy, right? So it is my will that holds me back, right? That Augustine pessimism at work again, right? So now that he is no longer a Manichaean, right? Hopefully you got that term by now, right? He's no longer within the Manichaean tradition. He can't simply think that it is the sort of the force of darkness, right, that is compelling him to sin against his own will. He now knows that he himself must ultimately be responsible for what? His own actions, his own failings. But how can he account for the fact that he can't simply will himself, right? Force himself to stop sinning, right? Even though he desires to stop sinning, right? I can't will myself to stop sinning, he says, even though I want to stop sinning, right? So I need help, right? Uh, um, and so Augustine kind of devises a theory of the divided will, right? So you should have seen the divided will, right? It'd be a good thing to kind of lock in for your paper if you're going to write on this. The divided will. And so in general, an act of the will is quite simple, right? When it comes to, let's say, moving an arm, for instance, right? All one has to do is will the arm to move, right? And it does so automatically. The will, and action, I will my arm to move, are one and the same, right? I will it and I act upon the will. On the other hand, it may not be quite that simple to think that we can overcome illicit desires, inclinations, simple by willing them to disappear. I've been a fat boy all my life, right? Sometimes I will myself to not want no chocolate, right? You could say, but don't eat it. Well, it ain't that easy. It ain't as easy as lifting your arm, right? That kind of thing, right? It's hard for certain inclinations. Obviously, some of us are inclined to do many things that may be sinful or certainly bad against us. And so Augustine understands that, right? And so I may desire to stop smoking, for instance. I don't smoke, but let's say you smoke. But instead of being able to throw away my cigarettes or throw away my marijuana, I experience a conflict, right, um, within my own will. I want to stop smoking. I want to stop drinking. I want to stop fornicating. I want to stop pornography. I want to stop eating chocolate, whatever it is, right? But I find myself incapable of doing so. Why? Why the conflict, right? Well, I think Augustine tries to tell us that it's not that I am not really desiring, right? It's not that I'm not really desiring to do the good, right, fully. Part of me wants to give up the evil, give up the sin. But another part really doesn't want to give it up, right? Like, you really don't want to stop smoking. You really don't want to stop drinking. And so, because it's the pleasure, right? I'm operating out of what? Libido dominante, right? It's the pleasure. So, I am not completely sincere then in my desire to stop smoking or drinking or fornicating or whatever. So, I lack a what? A will to do what is sort of unified enough to help me kick the habit, right? The problem for Augustine here then is not that he does not want to follow God's law, right? His anguish over his moral failings sort of clearly um, indicates that sort of he does want to stop, but that he does not deliberate enough in his commitment to the God's law, right? Another way of looking at it is that, like, if the will already desires what the command imposes, a command is given sort of half-heartedly and not obeyed. Does that make sense? So if my will desires what the command imposes, I really want some chocolate. And then you kind of convince yourself, okay, after this small piece of chocolate, I ain't gonna eat no more, right? Or if I just had a little drink, right? I want to stop drinking, but the desire overtakes, right? And so if the will then desires what the command imposes upon it, a command is sort of half-heartedly given, right? And definitely is not obeyed, right? So, it's almost useless to sort of give the command, I'm not going to eat this chocolate. Yes, you are, right? Because your will is aligned with the chocolate and not in the giving it up. Does that make sense, right? And that's what Augustine is wrestling with, right? And in order for Augustine to sort of overcome this division within his will, it is important for him to sort of will resolutely, right? Will more strongly and sincerely to follow God's law, right? And not in a sort of a half-hearted way, right? Um, and so later in the Confessions in chapter, still in 8, he says that although the principle he wants to, in principle, he wants to adopt a Christian lifestyle, he does not, in fact, really want to give up his lustful life, right? I want and he says, where does it say that? I was afraid that you might hear me too soon, right? I love that line. And cure me too soon from the disease of lust, right? I'm not ready to give it up, right? I want to be healed. I want to be cured. I want to not do it, but what? Just give me one more time. Give me one more time at the club. Give me one more time with my boyfriend and my girlfriend, and then I'll stop sinning, right, or something like that, right? Um, and so in essence, he preferred satisfaction as opposed to the eradication of the satisfaction, right? So when he's in this sort of moment of solitude, moment of supplication and lament in 8.7, right, 8.7, to be made, he says, to be made chaste and and con- and continent, but not yet. I want it, but not yet. I want to stop, but not yet. That's symptomatic of one who is not yet fully committed to changing his life, right, and changing the requirements of the operating law, right? And so, and then as later on he says, well, in the midst of his struggles with the divided will, Augustine receives a surprise from um, I can never pronounce his name, but Pontin, yeah, the Pontisianus, or I never knew how to pronounce his name. I forgot anyway, but Pontisianus, right? But he was an African, right? And he noticed a collection of Paul's epistles laying around on a table, right? And expresses his delight that Augustine is reading Paul, right? And Pontianus goes on to tell the two about the conversion of St. Anthony and about the various sort of communities that ascetics, and I gave you that word in your definitions, ASCETICS, ascetics living in the desert, right? And so after describing these incidents, Pontianus then recounts an incident where he had personally witnessed, and he tells Augustine that while he was there, he and three other friends went for a walk in a garden, right? Remember that? And they split up during the course of the walk. Two members of the group found a house in which some Christian ascetics lived, And upon entering the house, they discovered a book containing the account of life of Anthony, later on to be Saint Anthony, which they proceeded to read. As a result, right, the reading of the text, as a result of reading the text, one of the men became, sort of in love with God, right, filled with holy love just by reading Anthony's story, right? And after a period of sort of internal conflict, he decided to become a Christian, right? So he kept on reading, and his heart, where you saw it, was sort of changed. And as it soon appeared, his mind shook off the burden of the world, right? Conversion, right? How do you find conversion? In this sense, one of the three people found this through reading the stories of St. Anthony, right? And his heart was convicted in that sense, right? Um, uh, and then he says, I have now broken away from all our service now, this moment in this place. You may not like to imitate me in this, but you must not oppose me, right? I'm on a different level now. I'm doing something different now. I'm not going to hang out the way I used to hang out in the mind. And you may not be ready to do what I'm doing right now, but don't get in my way, kind of thing, right? But the truth is, right, his companion wasn't trying to oppose him, right? And I'm trying to be like you. I'm trying to follow you, right? And so in the story, when these two informed their fiancés about the path they had chosen, they in turn had decided to enter the service of the church. So everybody becomes converted according to the story. And so Pontianicius, on the other hand, still filled with sort of a love of worldly ambition, is not yet able to put aside his career goals and follow the rest of his friends, right? Remember I told you two went one way and one went the other, right? Pontianicius like, I can't do that yet. Although on the surface, it appears that this conversion account is meant to sort of inspire Augustine to reject the sort of the married life or his secular career. This really is not the aim that Augustine has in telling this story to the reader, right? Ultimately, what sort of impresses Augustine, or what's important to Augustine about Pontianus' story, is not specifically what his two friends had been able to give up, right? Their fiancés, careers, blah, blah, blah. But that they had been able to let go of what? Their will, right? Not what they gave up, but they were able to give up. They need to let go of their will. And he can't do it, right? So what does he say? The more ardent the love I felt for these two men, of whom I was hearing, and of how healthy they had been moved to give themselves up entirely to God, right? To be cured, right? That becomes important for him, right? And Augustine's aim in sharing this to the reader is like Pontianus' aim in sharing it with Augustine, which basically is to convince the reader that my own salvation, or one's own salvation, depends not upon the specific vocation he adopts, right, but upon the particular moral attitude, the will, right? The use of sort of medical imagery he does there, right? So you probably look at that, right? And so he says the reader must admit that he is sick, right? And that they are helpless to cure themselves, and that they need to rely totally and exclusively on the divine physician, on God the doctor, to take care and be cured, right? Now, Victorinus or Pontianus' friends, neither one of them had brought about their own conversion, right? God converted them. So their sole virtue in giving themselves up, if you will, to God in order to be cured, having done this, sort of, they experienced precisely what Augustine's mom, Monica, and in the middle, you didn't read this, but there's somebody named Alypius, but there's a conversion that Monica and Alypius eventually come to experience, a sort of a liberation from the slavery of their own habits, right? And so they have to kind of remove themselves from, right? Liberate from their own habits, right? All of them, Augustine says, right, in this chapter, had the weight taken from their backs and have been given wings to fly. Love that line, right? As a result, like they not only have the will to follow God's law, but now the power, the faculty, right? The power to do it as well. So these stories is heightened sense of despair that slowly begins to tear down the walls of Augustine's pride, right? For the first time, Augustine now recognizing that his intellectual prowess and strength can never assure him of happiness that he seeks. And for the first time, he begins to experience a real sense of his own moral failure, his moral weaknesses, right? When Augustine has reached the point of desperation, the confidence, the strength of his own will completely shattered, then it can sincerely and resolutely begin to look to the higher power to heal this division of the will. And it is sort of at this moment of sort of utter helplessness and a complete surrender that he experiences his greatest triumph in the garden, right? And so there's that chapter on the garden, right? That, is a kind of a cool chapter to read, and sort of, talk about the objects of his lust, right? Sex, power, fame. They taunt him with the challenge of whether he can live without it, right? Implied in this sort of taunt is the idea that if he cannot live without these lesser goods, then they rather than God have become the ultimate source, right? So either God is the ultimate source or fame, power, money, that kind of thing is his source, right? Of his desire and delight and that kind of thing, right? But at the same time, though, Augustine, he receives a vision, right? Urging him towards a sort of ordered love of worldly things, right? And so it's become a beautiful part of the chapter, right? Because he says, how can he maintain an ordered life when his will is still captivated, right? Longing for pleasure, right? But he's revealed that don't try to rely on your own strength to accomplish this, right? But by depending on God, right? And so that's kind of how that section kind of ends up. And then, like basically it was you, the Lord God, who gave me to them, right? Why do you try to stand by yourself, right? And so, um, there's this idea of putting oneself in the hands of God, giving oneself up to God's will because you can't do it on your own. And so the choice that Augustine is sort of faced with at this juncture of the confessions is whether to continue the path of presumption, the kind of intellectual arrogance, if you will. One might even call it the path of philosophy and self-autonomy, right? The path of the individual knowing the truth or gaining access to the truth, right? So you might want to need to give that up, and in doing so, continue to fall. If he doesn't, he'll continue to fall prey to the force of habit, or whether to humbly sort of implore the aid of the liberator, right? So either I will do it myself or I seek the grand liberator, the grand freer, which is God, and forsaking the pride that has been the sort of the central driving force of his life, right? But like we said the other day, like he don't want to give up Cicero, he don't want to give up other philosophical or literary texts. You don't want to give that stuff up, so it becomes harder. And so, there is a sort of African tradition of sort of authoritarianism that he's used to. He needs to get back to, but I don't know. Um, yeah, I don't know. But the question that Augustine, I think, ultimately faced with at this time is whether to forsake a philosophy of the will, right? So that's where Plato comes in, and Augustine, I mean Aristotle, right? That and the will that was considered um, the common intellectual currency of his time, right? And one has to have the will, right? Yeah. So he must decide in the end whether to take, the insights that he had garnered from reading Paul and the story of Anthony and all those stories to their logical and frightening conclusion, right? And in doing so, subvert a tradition or subvert a practice for which he had previously been the chief spokesman of, right? Just sin and desire and libido dominante. But if we understand it this way, one can hardly blame Augustine sort of for his reluctance to relinquish the last part of his self autonomy, right? You want to give it all up, right, in the midst of this crisis. Augustine's confidence in the power of his own will is at the lowest point right now in the Confessions, right? 8 and 9 is at his lowest point. He tearfully throws himself under what? The fig tree, right? And in desperation, he pleads for God's help, right? At that very moment, he hears the voice of a child, right? And he interprets it as God's voice, and it reaches his ear, right? It's a voice of a boy. I don't remember that, to tell you the truth. But I don't know which, it was a boy or a girl, but it was a kind of a sing-along songs that were constantly repeated. Take it and read it and take it, right? And um, so there was this interesting, close and to that. What else I want to say about that? Um, I don't know. I mean, hopefully you just see the sort of the vulnerability in 8 and 9, right? Um, and you see sort of how conversion, true conversion, I guess, especially in this sort of theocratic time, takes hold, right? So that I think that would be a good thing to take a look at as you're thinking about this chapter, right? Thinking about his trip to the garden, right? Throwing himself under the fig tree, right? And hearing the sort of the mystical voice of God, right? A boy or girl from coming from a house, right? And obviously turning to Paul, right? All these things he just sort of engages in, right? And I think one way I would probably say it is that Augustine's sort of he's sort of fond for indefinite expressions, right? At the most sort of crucial points in the Confessions, sort of reflect his belief that God sort of comes down and disposes all things, right, to us, right? Even if they're unrelated, right? Um, Augustine had such confidence in this sort of providence of God that he is content sometimes to sort of indicate a detail in the pattern of the sort of the most general way of to be precise and explicit about, small things that might distract one's attention away from really an important things of what providence, right? There was one line you might want to take a look at when he says he describes himself as being shot through the heart with divine charity, right? Similar to being on fire to file God's law, boiled again, right? Stuff like that. So Augustus sort of inspired to give up all his worldly ambitions and his desire even for a wife, and is instead moved to a life of celibacy in the church, right? But this is after all that. So that's all in book 8, right? And sort of by the beginning of book 9, he has sacrificed, his career as a teacher of rhetoric for his sort of newfound faith, and discovers that he is better able to sort of um, limit or rank the sort of the temporal goods in his life. Since now he realizes that the good things are not external to us; they're internal to us, which is God, right? And they're not sought with the eyes of flesh, right? Augustine begins to discover the joy that comes from loving all things in God rather than in themselves, right? So again, worldly things. Those who find joy in things outward, according to Aristotle, according to Augustine, easily become vain and waste themselves on things seen and temporal, right? In the moment, right? Um, and so he talks about this eternal simplicity, right? Um, and so he goes back to the garden and talks about, oh, what a foretaste it is, right? To be amongst God and things like that. But Augustine suddenly discovers that his greatest ambition is to be realized at the moment that has let go of all ambition, right? And so there's an idea, you'll see this idea of the mystical experience of conversion, right? And so you can take a look at that when you're reading, right? The Happy Life is an interesting read in chapter 9. Yeah, because he returns to Milan, um, and he and Alypius, right, and his son are all baptized, right? But we see that his happiness is cut short, right, by the death of his son, right? So, and then of course he goes back and he dedicates his last one to Monica, right, to his mom, and so um, you know, Monica's story comes right back, and he appreciates her humility and obedience to the church is sort of a stark contrast to the arrogance and self-reliance of who philosophers, were, and who had been seduced, or who philosophers had seduced Augustine in his early years, right? But hopefully you've read this, but if not, something happens to Monica, um, and um, and so you'll kind of see this relationship between him and his mother, and how that affects him, and so and basically, he comes to understand the sort of the fragility of life, and how things kind of come full circle. All right, that's 9 and 10. Take care.